Joining us now, Congressman, 1st District Republican, Virginia. We were just talking about you earlier, Rob. Rob Wittman with us. He's also the chairman of the Subcommittee on Sea Power and Projection Forces Readiness, one of the most powerful committees in the United States. And no matter what he says, you get that chairmanship, you basically run the Navy. Now, Chairman Wittman, good to have you with us.
John, great to be with you this morning. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, so you're in leadership, right? I mean, you're part of Republican leadership, and I don't know how to say this. You're an impressive guy, but I was really impressed the other day when you released your statement coming out in opposition of, let's call it for the sake of argument, Ryan Care, the plan to replace Obamacare, saying that it was just fell short on a number of your core principles. And you put a statement out. Not everybody's done that. I mean, it's one thing to come on the radio or go on CNN and make a comment. It's another thing to put a statement out because it's a statement. Would you share with our audience how you came to this conclusion?
Absolutely, John. Well, during the period of time that I have served, from the time that the Affordable Care Act was debated, it was voted on, to subsequent efforts to discuss Obamacare, repealing and replacing it, I've held firm to basic principles of what I believe needs to happen with our healthcare system. In everything that I've done, in the discussions, I've gauged them based on those principles. And then looking at where we are today with the American Health Care Act, I looked at that. I looked at the CBO evaluation, and I think there are some areas where you could question. But there are several elements there that I talked about in my principles that this bill doesn't achieve. And first of all is cost to consumers. That first element is problematic with this bill, and it's problematic specifically for folks that are age 55 and over. Because for those individuals, they will not only experience a premium increase in the short term, but they'll also increase premium increases over the long term. So it doesn't bend the cost curve down there. I would argue for those individuals, many of which are in semi-retirement or now have done their 30 years with their first employer and are now in either working for somebody else, maybe working for themselves, so they don't have a company-sponsored health plan. For them, that's particularly problematic, and it doesn't abide by what I think many Republicans have said here, and that is our effort is to bring down cost. Bring down cost. That's not what Obamacare has done. It's what this bill needs to do. It doesn't do it. First point. Second point is how does Virginia fare in this? Virginia's decided not to expand Medicaid. This does make some effort to level the playing field on those states that have decided not to expand Medicaid versus those that do. The problem is it allows expansion to continue for another several years. For those states that have expanded, that allows them to continue along those lines. It does give some remuneration to Virginia, but not in a way that I believe is fair and equitable. So I think that you have to address that as far as equity to the states. Mm-hmm. And then thirdly, we talked about making sure that people, John, had choice. And choice means within your state that you can have competition so that choice can be had. We have 5 states right now that have no choice in their exchanges. And the structural elements of regulations for the insurance companies stay the same in this bill. So that means those exchanges will still exist. There's no provision in there to say that now we open up the ability for insurance to be sold across state lines. And I understand all the limitations about what you can and can't do through reconciliation. But you can do more to set up a structure to say we are going to make sure that there's indeed choice there. Because, John, if you don't have choice, if you don't have more competitors in the marketplace, I fail to see how people are going to be able to tailor coverage to meet their needs, to tailor coverage to meet their budgets. Mm-hmm. Those things are lacking here. Now, those things I think are very significant. Mm-hmm. Can they be changed? Yes, they can. Will they be changed? Time is going to tell. We'll see what happens next week. I have let leadership know how I feel about this. But, John, those are the fundamental elements. There's some other things there, but I wanted to not go on and on, but highlight those things that I think are fundamental to any reform that is going to be successful and is going to abide by the things that have been said need to happen. Bring down cost and provide choice for consumers.
Right. And it's not this Ryan Care, for lack of a better name, that's just easier to say that. Paul Ryan's bill is not doing either of those, right? There's no long-term plan to bend down permanently the cost of care. There's no competition across state lines. And so they're not solving that. There's no provision for additional choice because insurance companies are still basically a monopoly. There's a handful of them. And then I got to get to the other thing, Chairman Wittman, is there's also a built-in insurance bailout. So it's for somebody like us, you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, if it's so great, why do we have to potentially bail out the insurance companies and take away their risk, right? I mean, if it was so fantastic, you wouldn't even have that in there.
Yeah, there is a provision there to be able to protect that. There is an element of that to say, how do we make sure we keep markets functioning? But then the question becomes, John, the difference between keeping markets functioning and if you allowed free markets, that is competition across state lines, would you need those support dollars? And then how are those support dollars used? I mean, we all talked about what happened with Obamacare with risk pools that guaranteed not just a stop loss for insurance companies, but also guaranteed a certain amount of return. Those things, I think, are problematic and don't get to truly people having choice and true free market mechanisms so that there is competition and competition to be able to bring prices down.
Well, it's a crony bill. I mean, that's really what it is. That's why the chamber got behind it. The insurance companies got behind it. This is basically a Wall Street crony bill they can't lose, and it's at the expense of everybody else. Look, I happen to believe that passing this can sink the Trump presidency. It's that bad. But let me ask you something else along this, Mr. Chairman, along these lines with this package. You've also got 15 million people that have insurance now or have coverage that didn't have it because it's subsidized. Right? Now, we all know you just can't kick 15 million people off the rolls. Politically, you can't do that. So what would be your thinking of being able to have some kind of a period of time where those people could be protected until we got someplace else?
Well, John, as you know, in the bill as it exists, it replaces a subsidy with a refundable tax credit. Now, I agree. You have to have the ability for folks that are financially unable, and especially families that are financially unable, to make sure that they have coverage. The question then becomes is, what's the best way to do that? What's the best way to make sure that it's truly helpful? And within that realm, if we are going to make sure we manage this, John, from a standpoint of government resources, and if you have the intention of saying there's still a lot of uninsured people out there, how do we get those people insured? You have to be able to bring the cost down per individual, so there's more entry into the marketplace. So if we don't do those other things, John, to be able to bring costs down, think about this, then the assistance that's provided by the government, even in the form of a tax credit, will go up in the future if you don't have the mechanisms to be able to bring costs down. So that's another one of the elements here that's worrisome. And if you're going to be able to cover more people, the only way you're able to do that is to bring costs down. If you're going to cover more people, you got to encourage states to do things creatively, to do things innovatively. Now, there are some dollars in this bill to provide grants to states so that they can do some experiments with Medicaid to find ways to do more, to cover more people, to do it less expensively, to make sure they're treating providers properly. But all those things have to happen without the limitations that I think still exist in this bill within that particular marketplace. And if you don't do that, the things that we talked about doing, bringing prices down, providing choice, making things better, are very difficult to achieve.
I think you're right. And I think that even limited government conservatives, like many of us and certainly many of my listeners, they just want smaller government. They don't want the government involved in these things. I think that all of us could go with a government involved with subsidy plan. I don't know what you call it, subsidy, tax credit, whatever, not to take into consideration the 15 million people on Obamacare now that didn't have insurance that now have is being subsidized. If there was a solution in the back end, and I think everybody's problem is this thing fails in fact, it's worse than Obamacare because it's only covering 50% of the people that are being covered now that are getting the subsidies. So a 7.5 million get kicked off. And for some people, they will actually spend more. So there's no cost-saving provisions on the back end, and it continues to bail out insurance companies. And as you mentioned, and I've said for 2 weeks, this thing is a disaster for Virginia. And I tell you, when you look back at the fight, I got a long memory, Mr. Chairman Wittman. You look back at the fight that we had over Medicaid expansion and how we went through that for 3 sessions, 36 months, government shutdown, Senator Puckett, the whole thing, and to look back on it. And now you look at the plan that's out there. I mean, it makes us that fought Medicare expansion look like total idiots. It's like, why did you do that? McAuliffe said, take the $10 billion. McAuliffe ends up being right. He said, what doesn't matter who's in power, the thing will get funded anyway, take the money. So that's exactly what happened. And so Virginia gets totally screwed in this deal. You're right about that.
Yeah, there's still a disparity there, John. Now, I'll give them credit. They've made some attempts to close the gap between states that did not expand and those that did. But there is still a gap, and if you're to look at this in a fair and equitable way, you have to keep those states whole that have decided, no, we think we can do things a better way. We think we can serve the citizens of Virginia in a better way. We believe that through innovation and other ways that we can drive down the cost, we can serve more people. Those are the things we need to be encouraging, John. Those are the things that public policy ought to say, hey, we want to give you even more incentive to do those things. So if you allow the provisions of this bill to go forward, you actually create a disincentive there. The ones that haven't done things in their own state to control cost of Medicaid actually get more than the states that did, and that those are the wrong incentives. I mean, for all of us, John, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, all of us want to be able to say, let's make sure people have access to care. Let's make sure people have care that where costs are going down and where they have quality of care. I don't care where you are, and so people ought to be willing to have discussions about how we do that. Now, there's a philosophical divide about how you think that's best achieved. There's a group of folks that say, hey, government's the only way to do that. There are another group of us that say, no, the free markets are better able to do that because then people get to choose and they get to tailor what's best for them. They get to be educated consumers. They get to understand what goes into the cost of health care. They get to help drive costs down. They get to be truly in control of their own destiny
right.
and making sure that they do what's best for them. Those are the things I think are principles that we have to put forward.
Right. And, you know, the administration is saying, well, there's phase 2 and phase 3. And here's the problem, Mr. Chairman, and I'll be blunt. Based on previous experience with your top congressional leadership, a lot of us have no confidence that we'll ever see phase 2 or phase 3. Well, it'll never see the light of day. I mean, unfortunately, I have to say this on air. Speaker Ryan has broke so many promises to conservatives. Omnibus, cromnibus, the next time, the next hill to die on. Nobody believes him. And that's his doing, not mine, but that's just the reality of a situation right now. Final question. Is it going to get out of the House?
John, I know that they continue to work on things. I talked with a number of members on both sides of the ideological spectrum within the Republican Party. Those conversations are ongoing. It's my understanding that there will be a manager's amendment, which will try to coalesce all these different ideas. And I've talked to leadership about the things that I want to see in the bill before it could garner my support. So I know that they are working on that. I'm not one of the vote counters, but I do whip a small group of people here, and I don't believe that the bill has the requisite number of votes to be able to pass. I think they still have some work to do. And I want to go back to your comment about things in a bill. If you're going to need things to happen in the future to make the bill that you have successful, through my experience, and this goes back to sequester, where I was promised, hey, don't worry about it, the super committee is going to work, all these things are going to be done, there won't be these cuts to defense, and guess what, John? It never happened.
That's right.
If this bill doesn't stand on its own merits, and you're going to rely on something in the future to happen where there's no guarantee. Remember, anything that happens in the future along these lines, HSAs, selling across state lines, need 60 votes in the Senate. If this bill by itself doesn't do all that it can do, and I understand the reconciliation restrictions there, if it doesn't do all it needs to do by itself, and you're relying on something else to happen in the future, then I don't believe that you're making the right decision. Now, for me, at least Speaker Ryan, to me, everything that he said he has done or has come to fruition. That was not the same with the previous speaker, and those were things that were told to me that never happened, and I can tell you, it shapes my decision-making, understanding that you better have what's before you today and believe that it can work, because if you're relying on something else in the future, even Dr. Tom Price, who I think will do a lot of great things there, you better be assured of your vote based on what you have in front of you, not what's going to happen in the future.
I don't think anybody could have said that better than you just did. That is exactly the problem with this. And I'm very encouraged on this St. Patrick's Day to find out that I think the best thing can happen is this thing just dies in the House and they go back to square one. Otherwise, I'm telling you, Congressman, this thing can sink the entire Trump movement all on its own. It is that bad. Thanks for being with us, sir. And as always, thanks for your candor and for being so forthright. More information, Wittman.house.gov.